Yeah. Thanks again, Josh. I have this great memory of junior high band, I think, and we were playing a John Ness Beck piece. And I really think he was the first time I looked at a composer's name and I made this connection that this human being wrote the music, if that makes sense. And so since then, I've heard of it, and we've sung a lovely setting of that piece with the choir as well. But this idea that humans create music is intriguing to me, since I get to do it every once in a while. So now some of you may know that I started work on my Doctor of Ministry program this past year. I have completed 2 classes so far, one last January, one last June. And I'm actually in the middle of my 3rd class. I did the coursework on campus last week. The sermon I'm giving this morning was a requirement of that last 2nd course in June. The title of the class, The Biblical Message and the Praxis of God. It's a real fancy way of saying that there are some essential documents from antiquity involved in our belief and our faith, and there might be some clues to how the Holy One works within those documents. Our assignment for this particular part of the class was to use conceptions of race, of ethnicity, of any kind of those obvious differences, and ancient and modern and even postmodern understandings of the term race, but to use race as a way to unpack a specific scripture. I chose the story in the Acts of the Apostles about this conversion of a centurion named Cornelius and the introduction then of a tanner named Simon, and they were both welcomed into the new community of Christ-following Jewish believers. I wanted to take some time to explore what's happening in this merge, in this scene that we're going to hear about. But I really was interested in exploring what happens to us when we have othered someone, when we have labeled them as different from us, but then what happens when we do an about face and then we suddenly want to include them in our community. All means all, right? Or are we just talking to a specific group of people? Does all means all really mean all are welcome as long as you look like us and act like us and don't constantly remind us that you are not like us, that you're another? It seems that we expect people to assimilate into our community, but we don't want to make any concessions towards their needs and wants or their particular and peculiar individual and collective identity. We're constantly othering people. I'm very guilty of this, especially when I'm driving. I bring up driving a lot. I'm not a good human being when I drive. I own that. I'm working on it, but I own it. But when I'm driving, I have a tendency to place almost every other driver on the road into a category called, well, I probably shouldn't say it. It's not a very polite word, but it conveys my irritation with their inability to, signal a lane change, or maybe their penchant to be texting, or eating, or talking to the kids in the back seat, or anything but driving. But I categorize them. I put them in this, I lump them all together. You're all idiots, for want of a better word. But it feels good, right? You get that irritation out of your system. It feels good, and you shake a fist. I other people in many additional ways. I do. We all do. How you look, how you dress, the color of your skin, the words that you use, even the expressions on your faces, even though I can't really see faces this morning, but I can see your eyes and your eyebrows. But this is a shorthand for most of us. It's a way of being in the world that provides clear demarcations, clear lines between us and them. It seems like we have this preternatural need to create these categories of other. But what happens When we've othered people so much that we cannot identify where they end and we begin. What happens to our classifications and our biases when we truly consider what unity might look like? Unity, that's a big word right now. What are we saying when we seek unity? I think in modern America, we're often saying this: we want you to join with us, but you must become like us. You must assimilate into what we are and forget your other ways. Let's look at that sacred text, that sacred document. Let's see if there's any insight into what the Holy One might be up to in this regard. So there's this iconic story in the Acts of the Apostles that is often referred to as the first conversion of a Gentile, someone who worships a Roman god or some other god instead of the God of Israel. It's a scene where Peter, who had been following Paul's orders, but Peter is sent for by a very powerful centurion, Cornelius. Cornelius desires to join into fellowship with Peter's new community of Christ-following Jews. Let's hear the story in the words of the writer of Luke and Acts. As Peter entered the house, Cornelius met him and fell at his feet in reverence, but Peter made him get up. "Stand up," he said. "I am only a man myself." While talking with him, Peter went inside and he found a large gathering of people, and he said to them, "You are well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection. May I ask why you sent for me?" Cornelius answered him, 3 days ago, I was in my house praying at this hour at 3 p.m, and suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me, and he said, "Cornelius, God has heard your prayer, and he's remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa for Simon, who is called Peter, Simon Peter. He is a guest in the house of another Simon, Simon the tanner, who lives by the sea." So I sent for you immediately, and it was good of you to come. Now we are all here in the presence of God to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us. Isn't that an interesting, lovely scene? Here's this powerful man, this centurion, this priest in the cult of the Roman emperor, which he basically was. When Caesar was made Augustus, he was claiming divinity upon the position of emperor, God on earth, as it were. So a centurion, especially one of the Italian cohort, as we're told Cornelius was, this centurion would have been seen as an emissary of the emperor, a direct emissary, a soldier in the army of Augustus, God on earth. He was a priest in the imperial cult. But man, what a coup for Peter and the new movement. They got this guy to join? And we get the story about this venerable centurion and how he's included into the new community, a community that until this act of unity had excluded anyone outside of the Jewish faith. If you remember, Paul had started to make room for Gentiles when he said so in many of his letters. We just sang it. That's from Paul. In Christ there is no east or west. There's no Jew, no Gentile, all of that sort of thing. But in this scene, we get a witness and an action. I always think that's why they call this book the Acts of the Apostles, because they're doing stuff in it, all through it. And there's also that weird offhand reference to that tanner. That's Simon the tanner. But it indicates that this particular outsider's extreme otherness well, his otherness might be too much to consider. A tanner dealt with dead flesh, which would have been taboo for any devout, Torah-abiding Jew to associate with. It would have been forbidden for any self-respecting Jew to be seen doing anything with a tanner. Now, we only get a couple of references to Simon the Tanner, but they're always accompanied by this information, which I find interesting. It's always Simon the Tanner who lives by the sea. So we get the name of the man, Simon. We get his occupation, a tanner, and a location, by the sea. We can use any of those three things to other him: an ethnic name, a not approved occupation, and, we love to put people down about the neighborhood they live in, don't we? So we could have othered him in many, many ways. But for a Jewish follower of the law of Moses, for a community that followed Torah, and they did so as an essential part of their side of their covenant with the Holy One, someone who dealt with dead animal flesh, such as this tanner, would never have been anyone to even consider welcoming into a Jewish type community. My theology holds at its core an ancient Jewish idea that we carry within us a fragment of the Holy One. I believe that upon our births we are gifted with this shard of God stuff. We experience it as our soul or our spirit. I also believe that this piece of God stuff returns to where it came from upon our deaths. I do not know how this looks, but I think for each of us, it looks how we believe it to look. And that's enough for me. But if my theology is to remain coherent, then it makes sense that when we recognize this God stuff in others, our God stuff responds. We want to return to God, and so we crave community because that is where we feel connected to these other shards of God around us. Gary Zukoff is an American spiritual teacher and author, and he has this to say about not belonging. Unworthiness is the inmost frightening thought that you do not belong, no matter how much that you want to belong, that you are an outsider and will always be an outsider. It's this idea that you're flawed and you can't be fixed. It is wanting to be loved, but feeling unlovable, or wanting to love and feeling that you're not capable of loving. And scholar Judith Liu asks this intriguing question regarding our self-identity, belonging, and the creation of the other, someone not like us. Does the recognition of that which is not us then make it possible to speak of us? Or is our articulation of who we already are, is that achieved by the description of the doppelganger of otherness? In simpler terms, are we defined by what we are not or what we are? Often we look at others and we say, well, I'm not like that, I'm not another. Cornelius, the Centurion, is othered by both his occupation and being assigned to that specific regiment, the Italian cohort. He must be pretty important if he's in the actual Italian cohort. This is the group that guarded the emperor. It's an important cohort. Simon, the tanner, is othered solely by his occupation and his location by the sea and his name, but I think his presence in the scene is essential because he provides one more avenue of entry into this new faith. The othering stands in stark contrast to the way Peter then responds to Cornelius' greeting. Now, I think it seems simplistic to say that Peter was opening up the new belief system to the Gentiles with his treatment of Cornelius. In the remembering of Acts, Paul, when he remembers Acts and writes about it, the Acts of the Apostles, and he does this in his letters, there's extreme tension between his conviction that the gospel embraced Gentile believers without any demands for adherence to Jewish Torah. And that's a big, important part of what Paul was struggling with. But he also had to struggle with the ability to preserve some unity with the apostles before him, for whom Torah continues to figure in their determination to preserve a unity between believers of Jewish and of Gentile birth, and between present and past acts of God. But I wonder, what if this conversion of Cornelius is part of a grander meta-narrative? I like that word, an overarching story, a giant story arc about how Gentiles can indeed join the faith. Well, in that case, it misses the delicate balance that Paul, through the eyes of the writer of Luke Acts, is constantly straining to maintain between those who demand strict adherence to Torah. You can't turn on a light switch on Sundays or on the Sabbath. That is work, and it is forbidden. Strict adherence to Torah. Or also those who believed and wanted a way for the outsider to come in. And all of this is in tension because the specter of the other is a powerful weapon in our world. So I want to think about these meta-narratives that are at play during the first centuries after the Christ event. These meta-narratives that are used to create categories of others, and how those stories are promulgated and sustained through subtle and often invisible ways. And also, how these meta-narratives continue to this day. How these giant arcing stories continue to inform our understanding of our faith. Here's a good example. The ancient Greek myth of Hades and Persephone would have been common knowledge to the people of this age of first century Palestine. Not unlike how you and I know Aesop's tales and fables or fairy tales. There would have been a cultural understanding of the three-tiered cosmology of the ancients. They had a very complicated cosmology with heaven, the firmament up here, hell or the underworld below, and then this middle part here where we all existed and put up with the constant bickering between those two other worlds. There would have been this cultural appreciation that certain behaviors would have dictated inevitable consequences. Okay? So when Cornelius falls on the floor in front of Peter, we are witnessing something that has with it a cultural expectation. But it's Peter's reaction to the moment that breaks with our expectations. Cornelius prostrates himself, and Peter says, "Stand up. I'm just a man." A formal greeting of a powerful man, the Centurion. He falls to his knees to worship or honor or reverence an emissary of Jesus. Peter, that is a potent image for people who wish to enter the Christ event from a non-Jewish perspective. Is Peter creating a space of equality, of comfort, hospitality for the Centurion? If he is, it's surprising. It seems like this greeting and response cements something that Peter has been thinking about since he was in Joppa. Remember, he had to go all the way up the coast from Joppa to Caesarea. He had heard that phrase, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." And he heard it in his vision 3 times. If I heard something in a vision 3 times, I would be very curious about what the Holy One was up to. And I think that's what Peter was doing here. But then we have to flip it. Is Cornelius' behavior a true act of obeisance? Is he showing deference to Paul by his welcome of Peter? With the information that we are given regarding Cornelius, we can conclude that he was a man of strength and vitality. Scholar Michael Koshinash describes him as a model of Roman virility, a centurion from the Italian cohort no less, who in this strange act of prostration indicates deference, if not subordination. Other researchers have seen this act as a warm but misdirected acceptance of Peter. Regardless, the author of Acts tells us that Cornelius met him, Peter, fell at his feet in reverence, but Peter made him get up. Stand up, he said, I am only a man myself. I think my line of inquiry is pretty cohesive here. Why would a man of strength and virility, Cornelius, who was high up the ladder in Roman society, why would he ever prostrate himself, literally lie down in front of someone in submission? Especially when you consider that the person he's doing this to is a subversive Jewish leader, a threat to the empire. My understanding of Roman hierarchical authority and power is that the ethnically pure Roman free male citizen is at the apex of Roman society. Everyone else, not of one of those descriptors, so women, non-Roman, slaves, etc. You descend down a ladder of oppression with the emperor at the very top and probably a female slave from a conquered territory towards the very bottom. In between those two extremes lived the rest of us. Empire is a powerful engine for the subjugation and the oppression of enemies and allies. I still ask it, why would this powerful centurion give Peter the time of day? There must have been something extremely appealing about the Jesus story and this new movement that spoke to Cornelius' soul. He's going to give up all of that. He's at the top of society, and he's going to give it up to join this new movement. In the story of Cornelius, Simon, and Peter, Simon the tanner, Simon Peter, we're shown human beings who were othered by each other, and they're being given an opportunity to belong. I think it's huge. And I also think to understand how subtle hints about how we can create tensions in each other almost instantly because of that foundational othering as a way to be in the world, that shortcut for dealing with strangers. But if we are indeed to welcome the stranger, we'd best be in a position where we can do so. And I think by changing the rules by which we other people might help us be a little more loving towards the stranger. I would ask the Holy One to assist us on this journey of acceptance. And I hope we never stop asking these problematic, critical, and sacred questions. Oh, and if a powerful person comes to worship with us, let us welcome her with open arms and a hearty, "We're so glad you are here." May you change us with your presence as we change you with ours. God is in both of us. May we see that and celebrate it. Amen.